Hello, LinkedIn, live again this week now. I've got my guest, Joe O'Connor, and we are talking about one of the recent episodes of the Happier at Work podcast where we talked about work time reduction. So it's been a couple of weeks, I think, since that episode has come out. Joe, do you want to tell people a little bit about you, who you are, and then we get into talking about some of the highlights from that episode. For anyone who hasn't listened to the full episode, there is a link in the comments below for anyone who wants to connect with Joe. He's tagged in this post, so you can just click on that and connect directly with him there as well. So Joe, take it away.
Thanks, Aoife. Pleasure to join you again. So my name is Joe O'Connor. I'm originally from Ireland, based now in Toronto in Canada, and I lead an organization called the Work Time Reduction Center of Excellence, and we work with companies all over the world, but mostly in the UK, US, and Canada to help them to move to shorter working weeks. We do this through consultancy and through research, and this is an area I've been interested in since about 2018. And have obviously been involved over the last number of years in leading the global trials of the 4-day work week in my previous role as 4-day week global CEO. So yeah, really enjoyed the conversation that we had a couple of weeks back, and I hope that that people get the chance to listen back to it in full.
Yeah, and I suppose the purposes of this, and sometimes people get confused, they think this is the podcast episode, and I need to kind of remind people sometimes this is not the full podcast episode. This is kind of a quick summary, a quick synopsis of some of the key points that we covered. And for anyone who's listening live, or if you're listening on the replay as well, feel free to post comments. I'll see them as they pop up. I think there's maybe a slight 10-20 second delay between the software that I'm using and LinkedIn. So we may not see it immediately, but I'd be happy to answer any questions, whether you're watching on the replay or whether you're watching live with us today. Joe, do you want to kind of talk to us about some of the shifts that you've seen in this, maybe in the attitude towards reduced working hours, because it's gained a lot of traction, I think, especially even pre-pandemic. I started seeing a lot more about 4-day working weeks and things like that. Do you want to kind of talk to us about the evolution of it?
Yeah, I think you're right. This is something that pre-pandemic was picking up a little bit of slow growth from a very low baseline from leaders and organizations that were innovative and saw the opportunity to use this as a way to both boost productivity within their business, but also to enhance employee well-being. And I think that growth phase that we had during the pandemic, where this has become something that now feels very much more like a normal workplace model that many businesses are considering, was driven, I think, by the labor market and predominantly. Companies were attracted to this because they saw the opportunity to differentiate themselves in a very competitive recruitment market. And then for employees, I think for many of us, the experience we had during the pandemic caused us to reevaluate what's important. And I think this idea of having extra time off or extra time back as a benefit is something that's maybe higher up the priority list for people now than it once was. So certainly this is something that has seen a period of steady growth, but often, I was saying to somebody the other day, it is in some ways a victim of its own success as well, that because there's been so much coverage and so much positive attention that sometimes, that leads to a lot of myths and misconceptions about what this is really about. And I think that's something we got the opportunity to really delve into in the full podcast was, what is it that we mean by a shorter working week? And what does that look like in practice? How does that play out within organizations?
Yeah, because I think, you're so right. I think some people think that it's maybe reducing to 4 days, but you're working maybe 10 hours a day across 4 days. I'm just using 10 hours a day as an example because right now I can't divide 37 and a half hours. That is the standard working week in Ireland across 4. But yeah, sometimes I think people get confused with what it actually means or how to go about it, or say that would never work for me in my company, or that would never work in this industry. Do you want to kind of maybe tackle some of those myths that exist out there?
Yeah, I mean, certainly one of them is this idea about that this is just about restructuring the same number of hours of the existing work week. Another is that this automatically means a 3-day weekend or everyone has Fridays off, when in actual fact, there's lots of different ways that you can design this, to meet the needs of your business, your industry, your clients. And I think one of the fundamental ones is overlooking the fact that at its heart, this is an operational excellence project and this is a change management project. And in order for it to succeed, it really relies upon employees rising to that challenge of how do we change the way that we work in order to make this sustainable for the organization? And that does involve streamline operations and looking at how you're going to improve processes. So this is not necessarily an easy lift or a magic bullet or an automatic solution to all of your problems. Often it will actually surface a lot of problems that maybe up to now had been hiding, and little frustrations that maybe people had just previously got on with. This really puts pressure on your systems in a way that can challenge you as an organization and can challenge your people, but can also offer a real opportunity to make your organization more efficient and give people a benefit that is truly life-changing if you can manage to pull this off.
Yeah, no, I think it's brilliant. And that is something that we did talk about on the podcast, the fact that it may surface some of the issues that were underlying that you didn't even know you had. And it's not a case that the reduced working hours are necessarily causing those issues. It's just that they're bringing them to the surface because of the nature of what needs to be done in order to realize that reduced work time, essentially, and this outcomes-based work and really focusing on outcomes. Something that always sticks in my mind was something, and it's not a client relationship or anything. It was a friend who said to me a few years ago, she said, I put in 2 hours extra on a Wednesday, therefore I feel it's okay to leave 2 hours early on a Friday. And I think this is the mentality that we've kind of been brought up with in organizations. It's this 9 to 5 mentality, and it's all hours and input based. Do you want to talk to us about the mindset shift that's required in order to go from this like hours based work to outcome based work?
Yeah, it's certainly a mindset shift, and I think you've described it well. This is about saying we are trying to achieve the same results or better, and the same outcomes or better, but the inputs are very much up for grabs. And I think it's a shift of kind of recognizing time is a very important input. Like, we do not encourage organizations to stop tracking how you're spending your time, which sometimes they find difficult because they're like, is this process not all about stopping focusing on time and starting focusing on outcomes? Well, it is, but time is still something that matters in the sense that, time, effort, resources, these are all things that kind of contribute to, how you're able to deliver those outcomes. So, it is about very much putting a microscope on the way that you're spending your time and finding ways that you can deliver the same results in a more efficient manner, I think is really at the heart of this.
Yeah. And I think, this idea, like, that's kind of, it's surprising. I think a lot of people would be surprised to hear that they need to monitor their time still and really understand how they're spending their time. But I think it makes total sense in terms of looking at, well, what is it that needs to be prioritized here if I have this amount of time? And that's probably one of the issues that gets surfaced, that maybe priorities are not clear. Expectations haven't been really clearly set around the quality that's required or the amount of time that needs to be put into something. And that's certainly, if I think back to my own corporate days where I was delivering presentations to clients, like, you could spend an extra 2 hours or 4 hours making the presentation look pretty or putting in all of the transitions or animations. But what value are you really adding, and what benefit are you giving to the client to have all of those stuff, aside from the fact that it looks like you can use PowerPoint, in a really slick way or something? And those kind of things it's busy work, really, isn't it? And monitoring what people are up to, what priorities they have, and how they're spending their time for that reason, I think is really important.
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting ones is this idea that, often organizations have when they start on this journey, which is, we're moving to a shorter work week, but the one thing that's sacrosanct is, if the client says jump, we say how high, and we have to absolutely provide the exact same service that we did in 4 days rather than 5. And sometimes we challenge that because, yes, you need to absolutely maintain the same quality of service, but, it's about really looking hard at, are there things that are being provided with immediate action when they just need an immediate response? Is it a case that you have a culture in your organization where as soon as an email comes in from a client, everything else gets dropped, regardless of, whether that is genuinely urgent or not? So there might be times where it isn't about just recreating the way you did it in 5 days and doing it faster or quicker. It's about saying we need to rethink our boundaries. We need to rethink our expectations, because some of those interactions are actually a productivity suck because it's pulling people away from focusing on the high value, high priority work that maybe they were previously engaged in. So, you really need to put everything on the table in a very genuine way.
I love that differentiation between the immediate response and the immediate action. I think exactly as you described it, sometimes if a client sends an email, you think you need to drop everything and take action straight away, when in fact you just need to acknowledge the fact that you've received the email and it will be actioned in accordance with whatever other priorities you have at the moment and wherever that slots into the priorities. So it's a really important distinction, I think. And sometimes the temptation is to be that always on and the first responder, and I need to get back to this immediately, when in fact what we really need to have are important boundaries and communication charters around how we interact within our own teams, but also with our clients as well.
For sure, yeah. And this is something, it's not just a well-being issue, it is a productivity issue in terms of, lots of organizations we've worked with who are extremely busy. They have just no concept of deep focused work. They have no concept of the idea that you need to build in time to actually, think about, focus on the things that really matter in driving your business. And it's just about squeezing everything else in terms of internal meetings, client response. So that's a really important part of this, for sure.
Yeah, and you've reminded me now, another one of the important highlights, I think, from the full podcast episode is around this idea of meetings. And do you want to talk to us a little bit about meetings and the role of meetings, I suppose, in this reduced work, week?
Yeah, I mean, this probably won't surprise anybody who's been following this, that one of the most common areas that organizations will attack when they are starting the process of trying to reduce their work time is meetings. And we know that this is an area that for many organizations is a pretty significant inefficiency. We know that according to a recent Microsoft study, we're having about 250% more meetings now than we were at the beginning of the pandemic. So, this is not just about the number of meetings we have. Like certainly we see a common tactic is kind of canceling standing meetings and just starting from scratch again, and almost making every meeting need to justify its purpose from the beginning, rather than, we've been doing that meeting for the last 3 years, so that's obviously got to continue. So it's not just number of meetings, it's how long are the meetings taking, how well are they structured, who's in the room or who needs to be in the room, how much of it can be done asynchronously versus in real time. So really thinking in a very purposeful way about meetings is one of the kind of the easy wins for a lot of organizations who are starting the process.
Yeah. And I think, just as a slight aside on that, I read something probably about a month ago at this stage from Dan Pink, and it was very jarring. He said, no agenda, no attenda. And that was his kind of attitude towards meetings. So if you don't provide an agenda in advance, then I'm not going to attend your meeting. And I think it's a clever way to sort of say you need to have an agenda for meetings. But I think with this situation, it could even be a chicken and egg situation, in that people are too busy to take a step back and think about how to do things better, or how to do things more efficiently, or how to reduce the amount of time that they're spending at work by systematizing and by prioritizing tasks. And so they don't take that time to get started. And so it becomes almost a vicious cycle of staying in that level of busyness.
Yeah, and what you've said there has kind of reminded me of an area that we touched on during the podcast, and it's this question of collectivism versus individualism. And I shared something on my LinkedIn around how 6% of inefficiency in modern organizations is down to the individual, and 94% is down to systems and structures. And so if you design a work model which is very much around, the benefit flows to the individual, it's discretionary for the individual to decide when and where they take that, then often you're just going to have individual behavioral responses that focus on the 6%. How can I personally become more productive? Whereas when we talk about things like meetings, and we talk about things like how we manage distraction, how we use technology, how we collaborate, none of these things can be done in a silo. These all require, a collective framework and an incentive for collective action. And I actually think at its heart, that is one of the big virtues of the shorter working week, is that it really creates that positive tension where, The benefit is very universal, it's very equitable, and there's a sense of collective ownership in terms of taking action to actually address the structures and the systems that really matter in terms of driving productivity.
So you might say it's about bringing people together rather than putting them into competition against each other, which I see quite a lot in a lot of organizations where people are kind of competing for resources. This is more about bringing them together and how to solve this problem collectively.
Sure. And I think that's why, like with a lot of things with the shorter working week, things that feel quite counterintuitive on the face of it play out like that in reality, where, one of the big concerns organizations have is, I can see how we can become more efficient or more productive if we cut out some of the fat or we cut out some of the waste. But is the thing that's going to suffer for that, is that going to be collaboration? Is there going to be less time for people to socialize, for people to develop those, connections and bonds, those relationships, those kind of team building moments? But in actual fact, the experience often tends to be the opposite because of the nature of the process, because the process requires people to really work together to figure out the solutions. You tend to get this sense where even though we're actually spending less time at work, the quality of our in-work collaboration has actually increased.
It's really, really great to hear that. Any kind of parting words before we wrap up today? Reasons for people to listen to the full podcast episode, for example?
I think that, this is a very fast evolving space. And the reasons why companies were doing this 12 months ago is quite different to the reasons why many companies are doing it now. And we're seeing this play out in terms of the whole discussion around back to the office, where we are seeing an increasing number of organizations, whether it's because the type of work or the industry that they're in means that they aren't able to offer the same level of remote and hybrid options as maybe some other organizations, or quite genuinely because leaders have a little bit of a more traditional old school mindset in terms of wanting people back in the office. We're now seeing the shorter working week become something that is offered as an alternative or as a carrot to try and get people back in, which probably is something that I wouldn't have seen coming 12 months ago. When, the vast majority of companies that were doing this were doing it to complement remote first or very hybrid heavy work models. So I think that this is here to stay. And I think that the kinds of organizations and leaders that are attracted to it is widening versus what might have been the case a little while ago.
Brilliant. It's great to hear. Thank you so much for your time today, Joe. And thanks again for your time on the podcast. For anyone who enjoyed today's session and you haven't listened to the full episode, the link to the full podcast episode is in the comments below. So go and check out the full episode and feel free to connect with Joe, who is tagged in this event above. So thank you for everyone who tuned in live today or whether you're watching the replay. And thank you, Joe, again for your time.
Thanks, Aoife.